Okay, so I'll start with one of my favorite graphs from this analysis. What this is showing you are, on the y-axis here, is app loads per day for users across all the applications in our system, graphed against, on the x-axis, crashes per day. So 0 there is you can think of as your baseline churn. The red dots represent users that are churning, that are leaving the application. The teal dots represents users that return to the app. Now, you can see on the 0 just natural churn occurring. The interesting thing about the graph is that as crashes per day increases, you can see that the corresponding red dots increase. So you see that users are churning as crashes per day goes up. Now, one thing to look at is the fact that you have users that are heavy users, users that load the app many times per day as you get further up in the y-axis, and those users tend to be more resilient to crashes, which intuitively you'd think would be correct. You have your heavy users that would end up taking a lot of pain before they ultimately leave the app, where you have on the bottom of the graph your lighter users. And these are users that are much more susceptible to crashes impacting churn rates. Now, this report has looked at crashes, but you may be familiar with a metric called crash rate. Crash rate is typically just a measurement of the number of crashes divided by the number of app loads for a certain application. Well, if you're talking about a graph that looks like this, and you're talking about churn, you really need to break that out again by user cohorts, or by more of a per user crash rate. So in other words, if you load up an application twice, but one of those times it happened to crash on you, you actually have a 50% per user crash rate. But of course, overall, it doesn't mean the application has a 50% crash rate. It just means that for a certain segment of your population, they're indeed experiencing that issue. So for this report, we wanted to break out that metric because it's relatively new for most people. And we wanted to measure, well, what would that look like? Let's ignore users that didn't experience any errors. So, you see we didn't graph percentage of users with a 0% crash rate, but instead focus on, for users that do experience a crash, how often does it occur? And the results were actually pretty surprising. You can see it in the headline there. 70% of users that have a crash experience one every other time they load the app. In other words, that crash rate is about 50% for 70% of your users that experience a crash. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, all of this analysis, this voiceover that I'm giving, it will be recorded so you can go back, but also I encourage you to check out our data site, which hosts this report, which is at data.apptelligent.com. You can go to the research page there, pull up the report, and follow along as I'm going here. There's also, you can read more about what this type of graph means. All right. So, I think intuitively, again, you would think, yes, a high crash rate will negatively impact my churn or my retention. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, for the first time, we've shown the correlation. This is exciting for many reasons. Well, as a product manager, as an engineering manager or developer, you often have a large amount of work to tackle. Ideally, you're focusing on fixing features and not bugs. So you'd ideally want a data-driven approach to where do you invest your team's time, and how do you rank the importance of these various issues that are cropping up. Well, now you can see just what the impact is based on your crash rate. And so we see here, as the per user in this graph right here, on the x-axis, we can see the per user crash rate. And as that increases to 100%, in the y-axis, you can see the corresponding increase in churn. And so what we've shown for, and remember, we're talking about two different types of retention now for both rolling retention and day one retention. What we've shown is it has a huge impact on both. So for overall churn, for rolling retention, the quote-unquote hard churn, where users basically just leave the app, we showed that Crash's increased churn by as much as 534%. This represents a 6x overall increase from the base level of churn. We also looked at this data from the standpoint of, well, how does it affect users just returning the next day in general? And it turns out that was even higher. It had an 8x increase, or another way of saying that is users were up to 8 times less likely to return the next day after a crash. Now, we've been talking global numbers, but you may be wondering, well, how does this vary depending on the App Store category? And if you've been thinking that it does vary, you're right. It does depend on the category. So here you can see the most crash-sensitive and the most crash-resilient categories for both rolling retention and nth-day retention. Now, just staring at this, one of the immediate takeaways was that you see a lot of revenue-critical categories bubbling to the top. A lot of App Store categories that you lose a user and it has a huge impact. So you see shopping there on the top 3 on both lists. Business and finance on the top of both lists. It's that increase, that churn multiplier, by the way, is related to, if you think back to the numbers I gave you in the previous slide, so I'll just repeat that here just so you remember it. The overall average for rolling retention was a 6x increase, and so you can see how these fare against that. For nth-day retention, they were 8 times less likely to return the next day, so you can see how these compare as well. Now, let's look at the crash-resilient App Store categories for a second here. As we thought more about these, it makes sense. You have something like if you think about travel and local, you have an airline application where you need to pull up your ticket. If that crashes, most likely you will try the app again to pull up your e-ticket. The same goes with an addicting game. You may be more willing to, give it some more slack. The fact that it has poor performance, given the fact that you just can't put that game down. That can't, again, the same can't be said about the many retailers and financial apps out there. It seems to have a much bigger impact. So if you attempt to buy something at your favorite department store, maybe you'll give up and go to Amazon, as an example. And just as a reminder, as I go through this, if you have questions, please put them in the question box on the webinar tool. All right. So we've been talking about 2 different types of retention. And what we also wanted to do was compare them against each other. So again, we see on the x-axis that per user crash rate that we described earlier. On the y-axis, we see the churn percentage. You may have noticed when I was giving you the overall averages in terms of the increase in churn rates, that hard churn or rolling retention was slightly lower in overall impact. It was 6x increase in churn as the per user crash rate approached 100%. And the nth day, or did users return the next day, that was 8x less likely. Now the reason for that is, well, you have users that will give the app another chance. That's what that's saying. So you have 8 times less people returning the next day, but let's in the next week or the next month, they'll pick up the application again and give it another try. Of course, eventually, if they keep running into those issues, they will churn. But it's good to know that it's not the end-all, be-all. That you can go back, resolve the issues, and actually what we encourage you to do is actually proactively reach out to those users, which is something you can do with our tool, where you can identify users impacted by a particular issue. You can pull those users into that list of users into your favorite marketing tool or into your favorite push notification tool, and either send them a push notification or email saying, hey, we're working on the issue, or hey, it's fixed, you should come back and try to use the application. And one thing I'd encourage you to also do is, if you do use marketing tools, to check out our integrations. If you go to integrations.apptelligent.com, you'll find that we actually integrate with many of those products, and will enable you to do exactly what I just said, proactively manage your customer success. All right, let's end with an example, and then we will go to questions. So I think one thing that you really need to remember that some people forget is that it is much more expensive to acquire a new user than to retain an existing user. Anywhere from 5x to 25x more expensive. And I'm not just making up these numbers. This is from Harvard Business Review, from a variety of surveys. And it makes sense. You have some LTV, some lifetime value attached to a user, and the plan is to monetize them over time. And there's, of course, acquisition dollars at stake to acquire new users. So let's take a simple m-commerce example. You've lost 600 customers due to a crash. Well, you can imagine attaching an acquisition cost to those customers. Maybe it's $50 a user. So you need to spend another $30,000 just to win back that 600. Well, if you assume your lifetime value is about $300 per user, that means you've lost $180,000 in future revenue. It's even worse when you think about that you're a business and you have goals to actually, grow and gain users. Well, now you've had to make up the 600. If you had a goal to grow another 300 customers, that means you just tripled your customer acquisition cost to reach that goal. You have to gain 900 customers just to get you back to your original 300. Now compare the future lost revenue and the increase in customer acquisition costs compared to the little time you'd spend if you're able to direct your team's time with a data-driven approach to understand where are these issues coming from, what is the business impact, so that you can quickly triage, prioritize which ones to fix, have data to go back and recreate it in your lab, and then quickly mitigate the issue. So that's what I encourage you all to do, to think about. And with that, don't let your apps crash and churn, and let's go to some questions. So I'll switch it back to Audrey, and I will answer any questions that I see here.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's webinar. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. Andrew, our first question is from David. The question is there any personal information collected while using your software or producing these reports?
That's a great question, and the answer is no. We do not collect any personally identifiable information. We work with a number of financial institutions and a number of major retailers and other folks that process money and very much care about data security and privacy. We also work with many teams that have data related to or applications applicable to children. So we're very careful to be COPPA compliant and not collect any PII. You can see the types of data we collect. It is performance data as well as anonymous user behavior data, so that we can understand how performance is impacting behavior and ultimately those business results.
Okay, thank you. The second question is from Gopinath. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly. The question is, what on average is a good retention rate?
That is a good question, and it really depends on many factors. It depends on your category. It depends on what type of retention you're measuring. It's actually complicated because it's typically not looked at, like you can see in our report, we broke it down by cohorts of usage. I mentioned there's another way of also breaking out your first-time users. Now, with any mobile application, there's a huge drop-off for first-time users. They'll download an app, try it once, and leave. The overall averages are lower, or I should say the overall churn rates are actually lower than you think when you start to look at your existing user base. You can find metrics in our report that spell out these different variations of what normal churn looks like. And I guess the last thing I'll leave you with there is, if you think about the different ways to measure it, you can measure it by looking at all applications on average, or you can measure each application and then average that result, if that makes sense, right? If you were to look at all applications and put them into the same bucket, you might see some skew from more popular apps that just have high retention rates. And so in the report, if you go through it, you'll see I've broken out those two numbers for you. And sorry, I don't have it offhand. It's just unfortunately, it's a very complicated answer.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. The third question is, how sensitive or resilient is the music streaming apps category to churn?
Okay, well, I do have the report loaded here, and there is a listing of the categories here. So we see that I'm in the rolling retention section here. So this is hard churn, and the music category is actually up there. It just missed the top 3. It's number 4 on the list. So it is very susceptible to churn.
Okay. The next question is from Herbert. How long is the data available to view?
So we actually we store trending information like this indefinitely for our customers. Now, if you're looking at crashes, we store the most recent 30 days of crashes. If they reoccur, it'll it won't get bumped out of the system. So in terms of trending information, you should be able to trend. We have customers that have been using this for years, and they're able to compare their their usage rates and their DAU and MAU and other metrics. We also have a custom reporting capability where if there's a certain time period or range or metric that you don't see in our portal, you can actually submit a custom report and have that generated for you. That's something we have for our enterprise customers.
Thanks, Andrew. Our next question is, how do you suggest handling users who become inactive after the first 30 to 90 days?
That's a great question. I think one thing to think about is, well, just why did they become inactive? I think that's a problem with a lot of marketing tools is, they'll tell you who and they'll tell you what, and they'll say, you had a drop off in a funnel, but they won't tell you why. And related to that user, if they did experience performance issues, I would, and assuming you've gone back and tackled the majority of those issues, I would encourage you to reach out. I think, there's a lot of companies aren't proactive enough with it. And the other interesting thing that you can think about is to do a re-engagement or reinstall campaign. So it's possible they've uninstalled the app, but you have their email address. So in combination with our tool and with other tools in the space, you can leverage those integrations I mentioned earlier and have send a campaign out saying, hey, try us again. We've addressed this issue. We fixed the problem, to get them back using the application. Now, if you're a retailer or you're in m-commerce in some way, travel, hospitality, you can always try to incentivize them through various coupons and other means. I think the interesting thing is to combine that with the cohorts of users experiencing problems. That way you can have a more directed message at them.
Okay, that's a good answer. The next question is from Kashan. Is this only for mobile apps or for apps that run on a desktop OS like Microsoft Windows or Linux?
So we do have a open source Xamarin connector for Microsoft platforms, if the apps are built with Xamarin. We focus on native applications, native mobile applications, iOS, Android, tvOS, NDK on Android. We also have some pretty unique support for hybrid applications. So we will actually automatically instrument web views that are present inside of native apps.
Okay, the next question is, I already have visibility into crash report, and the marketing team knows the churn rate. We think our crash rate is low, but churn is too high. What else can we do?
Well, I mentioned earlier that crashes is obviously just one small piece of the story. There are a ton of other types of issues your users can run into. You could have slow app load times. You could have cloud service providers failing. You could have certain flows in the app experiencing problems or taking too long to complete. So the idea would be to triage those problems, understand what the impact is on your user base, on your revenue, and just make sure that you take a look at our benchmarks to understand how well you're doing. Even if you think and by the way, I forgot to mention, even if you think you have a low crash rate, you actually need to compare it against the benchmarks in our system, because in fact, others in your category may also have even lower crash rates. You can find those in the product. You can also find those benchmarks available on our data site. If you go here on Android or here on iOS, you will find a lot more information.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, well, I think that wraps it up for today. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any additional questions, and thanks for joining.
All right, thanks, Andrew, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Apptelligent and our presenter, Andrew Levy, thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.